If you're able to access the chat box, you could share where you're from and the role that you play. All right. Welcome and good day, all. My name again is Ren Durayo. I use they, she pronouns. I serve as the co-director of the How Kids Learn Foundation, and along with the founder and my co-director, Sam Piha. Sam's out there somewhere. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Sam.
Today I get to serve as your host, but before we get started, I wondered if you would join me in a short stretch. It's Thursday. I don't know what time it is for all of you out there, but I'm guessing that you've been sitting down for quite a while. So I'm going to invite you to stand up, stand up, stand up. Oh, some people have a standing desk. Would you raise your hands over your head, take a deep breath in, and let the breath out. One more time in, and let the breath out. One more time in, and bring your arms to the right or the left, round your back, stretch and wiggle your fingers, and breathe in and over to the other side, stretch and wiggle your fingers, bend your knees and go down to the ground. How low can you go?
Very low.
Knees, your shins, your ankles, toes. Rope it. Keep your knees bent. Roll up slowly. And take your shoulders up to your ears and back. Take one more breath in. And relax your hands down. And make yourself comfortable. We are very glad you're here. For our topic today, after school programs and important spaces for emotional learning of teens. So emotional skills are now recognized as essential skills for young people to survive and thrive in their lives. And here's a news flash. Emotional skills are essential for all of us to survive and thrive in our lives. But the purpose of today's webinar is to inform us on how to best promote emotional learning among teens in youth programs. We are very happy to have Reed Larson and Natalie Rusk. Can you wave? Reed and Natalie here to share their research, and super grateful for panelists Ashanti Branch, Zamela Aziz, and Bill Fenese to engage in a conversation about the research from the perspective of their work with youth. In particular, but not limited to, working with teens of color, both male and female identified, and preparing teens for the workforce. I'm going to invite all of the panelists to give a more robust introduction about themselves when they first speak. A preview of how we think this time will unfold is that Reed and Natalie will share some information with us. The panelists will respond, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. We're going to invite you all to use the chat box. It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you have a question specifically for the panelist, I'm going to invite you to put that in the question and answer box. This just allows us to manage the question and answer in a more efficient way. For those of you who are wondering, a link to this webinar, the slides that are shared here, and the resources that are shared here will all be sent out to you following the webinar. I think that's all I have to share. So I'll turn it over to Natalie and Reed.
Hello, everyone. I'm Reed, and we're going to introduce ourselves later, but Natalie?
Yeah, I'm Natalie here.
And today we're going to talk about emotions, which is a really interesting topic because there's so many sides to them. And emotions are really powerful part of human experience. Strong emotions like anger, fear, and love can take over our brains and prevent us from thinking about anything else. But even quieter emotions like pride in doing good work can motivate and energize young people to work hard for weeks about something they care about. So there's a lot to discuss today. Teenagers, emotions, emotional learning, and the age period of adolescence is a time when kids are able to learn new, more advanced skills for understanding the multi-sided nature of emotions. Often when adults talk about emotions in teens, they talk about them learning to need to control or manage emotions, and our presentation is going to include that. We're also going to talk about how youth learn to use emotions in valuable ways, using that anger, anxiety, or love and constructively. So manage and use are going to be two of our mantras here. But just to get us started, could we ask all of you to think of what types of emotions arise in youth programs, maybe in your program? And if you're willing to share them on your chat, it'd be nice to just see a list of kind of some of the emotions that come up in your program.
So I'm seeing anxiety, excitement is another emotion, joy, confusion, frustration, curiosity, more anxiety and frustration, definitely. Happiness, calm, feeling of family, some anxiety, anger, curiosity, humor, and laughing. Also that feeling of pride, again, frustration comes up. So a whole range of, yeah, frustration. It's an emotion I'm really curious about because sometimes people see it negatively, but frustration shows you have a goal. You have something in mind you're trying to get to. So it's actually a positive sign some ways that you're really working towards a goal. Lots of humor, yeah, grief, young people experiencing grief. Some of these emotions arise in the programs, also outside of programs, right? Young people bringing in, say, grief, frustration, other things going on in their lives. So things are arising both within, outside, a whole range. And I think people don't always, yeah, I love this whole range, you know, joy, exhaustion, silliness, sadness. So I think people don't always recognize just how many, you know, it's not just all positive emotions. These are really important. That's part of what we want to talk about. The whole range can be really learning experiences and ways to connect with others. So
this is a great list, and I wish that we had time to just stop and get all of you to talk about, you know, what causes that emotions, how do staff members respond, how do these emotions affect teenagers, and then how do you manage that? In our research, we have seen that all or, but maybe not all, but many of these emotions that you name can be valuable opportunities for youth experiential learning about the world of emotions. So I'm going to start with one poignant example that might be familiar to you in some way. It's about anger and hurt and using emotions, and it involves a program serving Mexican-American youth in a rural, mostly white, small town near where I live in Illinois. And the group's meeting had started when Antonio, one of the group members, walked in, and everybody could see he was distraught. He had tried to join a school band, which he'd been wanting to do for weeks, but the white director and students were hostile and unwelcoming, so he left. and came to his friends, and the program had a very close-knit group. The adult leader, Juanita, saw how his distress really hit a nerve with the youth. They were first-generation immigrant families from rural Mexico, and their families had had experiences of racism in the town, but it was kind of hush-hush. And the youth in the programs had never talked about Antonio's experience or those experiences that they'd had. So she asked if they wanted to suspend the planned activities for the day and talk about Antonio's experience. And in the conversation that followed, the 8 youth shared their own experiences in the town and school, and they empathized with the pain and anger, frustration of each other's stories. And then they, Juanita said, it tapped into other nerves, the whole experience of prejudice. There was a lot of anger. We just got it out on the table, and the youth put each other's stories together. They connected the dots and saw how the emotions and experience of racism was not just an isolated personal experience, it was part of each of their lives. And she said that helped them really see kind of the whole system of racism within the town, of white racism, and to see it as a system of injustice. So that's some important emotional learning that kind of was emotion driven. And this conversation partly led to them kind of restoring their motivation for their mission of working with families in the community, Mexican-American families. And Sean Ginwright, some of you may know, has described these kinds of discussions and programs in a much fuller way. But I think that these kinds of discussions also help youth develop their moral emotions and sensibilities. It's like maybe developing emotional muscles for processing events like that, and then seeing them as injustice and responding with social action. So before we go further, we thought we'd say a few things to set the stage. And so first we're going to introduce ourselves. So Natalie, you want to start?
Yeah, and I guess I'll just say, as a kid, I was pretty overwhelmed with emotions, and I just found that having ways to think about them was amazing. Like, often people didn't talk about them like in school, but having adults in my life to say something as simple as like, grief comes in waves. That helped me make sense of my experience, deal with my experience. So I've always been interested in that. Most of my career has been developing youth programs focused on youth using technologies to express themselves creatively, like the first computer clubhouse program that's grown internationally. And later in my career, much later in my career, I just saw how big emotions and motivation are in learning. And so went back to study that. And during that, I heard Reed speak about youth emotions and emotional learning in a theater program and a paper. And I was just like, this is so powerful. And so I did my postdoc work, and that's where I got to learn. So a lot of my work is still in youth creatively using technology, but kind of on the side of just always had this interest in emotion. So it's exciting for me to be here and learning from all of you. Reed, do you want to share some of your background?
So I grew up in a Scandinavian American family where emotions were never discussed. And as a guy, it was like parents would ask what happened at school to say, and I would just say nothing, nothing, nothing. And so it was kind of a dark, unknown world. I don't know if emotions even existed or I could name them in any kind of way. So I've been studying social emotional learning in programs for 20 years, and in 5 different studies, one in which Natalie was part. We conducted over 1,000 interviews with youth and frontline staff, often following the same people over time so we could kind of get their stories. And we asked them to recount specific kinds of learning experiences, including those that involved emotions. And then we conducted rigorous qualitative analysis to really try and see the common scenarios of learning and experience and challenges and struggles, frustrations And so I should say we chose programs that had highly experienced staff and met general criteria for being high quality programs, or at least above average programs, because we wanted to see positive development occurring. The youth were 13 to 19. They were 1/3 African-American, 1/3 white, 1/3 Latinx. And this research was pre-COVID, so we might want to bring that up later. And so we have a lot of things to share, but I just want to kind of express humility that no one has a master framework that explains everything about emotions. There's so many different sides to them. And I know that our panelists are going to have really interesting things to say from their point of view. And in terms of the whole group, we've just really been looking forward to not telling you things, but ultimately having a discussion where we're sharing different points of view and kind of assembling different pieces to see larger pictures, as well as see the diversity of experiences. So I'm going to pass the gourd back to Natalie.
Just some bigger like overview points, just as Reed said, adolescence is a key period for emotional learning, and partly because of ability to understand complexity, reflect more broader social awareness. And this is really neat, like emotions are very powerful and complex, and things come in like, you know, the complexity of like, you can't just directly read, you need to like stand back and interpret what emotions are, being able to like a more advanced skill of anticipating other people's emotions, seeing emotional patterns, reflecting on mixed emotions. So there's a lot of skills, and we'll be giving examples, and youth programs are important places where this emotional learning happens. And so a lot of you, I mean, it's already like so important, but at this really emotionally difficult time for so many young people, I think the work that you're doing is harder than ever and more important than ever. But what do we mean by emotional learning? And I've found this framework helpful coming from Cal Izzard, where like 3 key areas that I've found helpful for thinking about, one way to group them. And one is just being able to recognize and understand and label emotions. So having ways to talk about them and recognize them. And it's sort of like being able to like see and anticipate patterns of weather. So to understand, that's ways of like talking about what's happening, because it often is like, we can't really necessarily, like that gets to managing, you can't really necessarily control what emotions you're having, but there are ways to manage them. And I think of that as like having tools like umbrella, or when it rains, that there are ways to handle it. And it's not just handling the emotions that arise, but it's also like sometimes changing the situation that's causing these emotions. Like what can we change that might affect us? Sometimes we can change it, sometimes we can't, but what are all those different tools and strategies for managing emotions that arise, including discussing them, and then using, often this isn't talked about, but how do you like tap and channel? Emotions have evolved for adaptive reasons. They give us information, and how we really heard from youth was very interesting from the interviews to really hear how they were using emotions, anger, worry, excitement, pride, to like get them and the people they were working with to achieve their goals. So these are the 3 different areas that we've found useful for thinking about.
Yeah, for thinking about learning about emotions. So we're going to get back to managing and using in just a few moments, but we had a couple of just key points from psychologists about emotions, which you probably all know, but just to have them on the table for today's discussion, which is, you know, as Natalie just said, emotions are reactions to situations, and that's part of their functions to help people detect and respond to things that are dangerous, unknown, positive, important. Emotions are also, of course, shaped by our past experiences, but they're also shaped by people's goals and beliefs. So that's another way in which learning can come in, or learning about others' emotions comes in. Sometimes people think about emotions and thoughts as separate, cognition and emotion as separate. And a lot of wise people from many different cultures have said no, emotions and thinking go together, and that emotional learning often involves training one's thoughts and emotions to work together in the service of positive goals. And then the last point here is that youth differ in their emotional dispositions. Different teens can have dramatically different emotional worlds, influenced by experiences, family, culture, temperament.
You know, for example, often in the US, like a goal is to get people excited or pumped up, but then in some cultures, like some East Asian cultures, more often that feeling calm and peaceful can be valued over feeling excitement. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how kids learn to manage emotions in programs. And I can't cover very much, but we're just going to give examples. So, as I've said before, sometimes the adults really just want kids to learn to regulate and stop those emotions. And what's really nice about program settings is we found that youth learn a lot of that regulation in a natural and effective way from experiences. So we've studied project-based programs where kids are working on arts, planning events, growing vegetables, and youth are often very invested in their projects because they chose a program that they like. And as a result, they see how anger spreads like wildfire in the group, and it brings the work to the halt. So they quickly learn to manage their anger, so they're not part of that. A more in-depth example is that youth told us how they learn to control the pain and anguish and frustration, which was on a lot of people's list, that come from their projects. So, in projects, things go wrong, plans break down, youth sometimes have grandiose plans, how their film is going to be great and their youth summit's going to be fantastic, but they encounter real world roadblocks and disappointments. As a result, they can have an emotional crash, a meltdown, and we've written some about meltdowns as really kind of sinkhole that it's pretty easy to go into: self-doubt, anxiety, despair, and kind of shutting down, and I don't want to come back. And that psychologists find that those can really be pretty unhealthy because if they get repeated a lot, because they really impair problem solving, and you never want to do that same thing again. But in programs, coaches and peers kind of get kids back on track, and it's not such a big deal, and give them perspective. And then the kids almost always end up with successful projects where they feel pretty happy about them. And so there's a whole kind of learning process there that takes place. We had one program in which kids worked for months on murals that were mounted on the Chicago L platform, and then they were vandalized the very first day. I mean, it was pictures of kids and their eyes were gouged out. So like there was a 4-week meltdown, collective meltdown of just how painful that was. But the leader kind of got together some funds and said, we're going to have a course for you in art restoration. They got a professional to help them first learn the skills, but also repair the murals. They had photographs, so they really, and afterwards, kids reported learning that, let me give you one quote, you get to points where life is horrible, but you always get past it. There's always ways to fix anything that goes wrong. And it's, Ann Maston, a scholar teaching about resilience, says that's the way you get resilience, is by, having those kind of setbacks and learning you can overcome them. Another youth, Liliana Villalobos, was in a program where they didn't have enough money to pay for restoration projects, but they planned a lot of events, and she found that, boy, every time there was a setbacks, and she'd go into kind of meltdowns, but after a while she learned it's a cycle. It's always, I'm excited, then I get worried, then I get to the freaking out stage, then I find the solution, like, oh, okay. And recognizing that cycle helped her learn that stress and worry are, and lots of other kids, are a normal part of projects, not a sign of imminent failure. Like somehow you think it's all about you, right? Like this is about me. Whereas, you see that, well, things just go wrong. It's how the world works. And so Liliana really wanted to learn to do more. And, a lot of us kids are really afraid of failure. I mean, adults too, are afraid of humiliation. And those experiences we found can be really empowering and really make a difference for years afterwards, that kids feel empowered to do things they never would have thought they could do before.
Yeah, I do think that's a really interesting thing that depending how you see worry is like, I feel like I'm afraid, does that mean I should quit? And I think a lot of young people take that worry, frustration as a sign that I'm not good at this and this isn't going to work out. A lot of you know this experience that a lot of times we heard from the youth that the leader encouraged them, or for example, in one project to say like, well, everyone goes through that at this point, and then if they can get through that and then they are successful in the end, they see their project and what comes out and the impact in their community, then they're often motivated. They learn, oh, worry doesn't mean I should give up. Worry is just part of the process, as we were saying, Liliana learned. And I felt like that was really powerful, because sometimes we think, well, let's not let kids be worried or anxious, but actually they're learning from that experience. If they can get through it and working with others and collaborating with others and have understanding about that, then they start to learn, oh, it's just part of the process, it's part of the work. I know we have more stories, but we're also coming close to time, but I guess I wanted to say a little bit about this idea of using emotions. As we said, like often when you read about teens and it's like, how do you help them manage it? But it's not always talked about, how do you help them use it? How do you tap into, like, again, the anger and saying like, what does this mean for us as this whole idea of emotions as signs, and that we can also have energy that they can channel. So let me just quickly show a list of just some of the ways that we've been looking at, of like helping young people build positive collaborative relationships when they go through a shared experience that they can talk about and reflect, and evaluating, like emotions give you information about how something is going and can help you understand like the feeling of what does good work feel like, yeah, worry is part of the process, or like feeling good about it, and developing moral reasoning, again, trying to understand other people's emotions and being able to reflect on your own, that they make you stand back from us, like wake you up from like what's going on here, to recognize some of the issues in your community or in your life, and like help you and other people's, and then motivating oneself and others. And the example of that being, so again, like channeling that energy, and ways that we've seen that, for example, Valeria, so we've heard a lot of youth, again, if they get through those setbacks, the kind of pride they feel in the fact that they did the hard work, that they got through those setbacks. So I'll be interested to hear if you have examples of that. But a lot of youth talked about how hard work and helping others, for example, Valeria and her teammates working on a documentary, they wanted people to understand these two neighborhoods they felt like were really misunderstood. And they came back with their footage and they felt like it just wasn't coming together, and they didn't do a good job, and they were having those doubts. And the leader said, everyone goes through this with editing, just keep going. And they just kept working at it and learning about editing. And then Valeria said at the end, they were so excited when they showed their film at the showcase. And she said, I learned that at the end, you're going to be proud of what you did. Even if you went through some hard times, it was worth it. And that youth talked about the powerful, positive feeling, like it was like an internal reward for their hard work, and it gave them motivation to keep going. Alonzo, in urban gardening, he had never done anything like that before, and he was kind of doubting it, but he had multiple experiences that helped him feel pride in like growing vegetables. He had no idea that, like, from the seeds, he had never seen that big tomatoes could grow out of that, and to be able to, like, then once they harvested it, to give back to people in his community, changed how he felt about himself. And he said, I was like, wow, I did this and it's helping others. I can do this, you know? And so it's those experiences in youth programs that you're offering that really shift young people's experience of themselves, and emotions are part of it, and going through those ups and downs and learning that they can learn to do that. And he said, like, it just motivated him to say, like, you can just keep trying harder. And he said, you know, there's no limit to feeling proud, because you can always do harder things and you're going to be more proud of yourself.
Should I jump in?
Yeah, I know we're at time, so I don't know if we want to transition to others. I know we have other things to say, just like the youth, the leader
maybe
role. But
2 more minutes. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess.
Please take your time. You're doing great.
Okay.
Important information.
Yeah, I mean, another word for using emotions is using emotions as catalysts. So as I said at the beginning, emotions have lots of energy to them. They help us to focus our thought. They help mobilize sometimes our arousal. And so kids in programs, and I'm sure you probably use it in this program, is they learn to use emotions to motivate themselves or to motivate children they're working with. They learn to give high fives and express love to each other as a part of collaboration. They learn to use, as I said at the beginning, to use them for moral reflection on what's happened to them. And your feelings are not always totally reliable judgments of what happened, but by talking to each other, it helped people sort out kind of the narcissistic hurt from, this is happening to lots of people, and this is really something we need to do something about. Okay, Natalie, you want to?
Yeah, so just, and I'm sure you'll have examples of like the important roles that program staff play. And it's really like, sometimes it's that creating a program culture where emotions are recognized, respected, can be talked about, modeling constructive ways of handling emotions as staff ourselves. And we heard that a lot from a lot of young people. They learned a lot from just seeing how emotions were expressed or situations handled from the program leaders, like that they stayed calm. They looked like they believed what we were going to be doing, they gave us confidence, and that they were willing to express their own emotions about things in constructive ways. So, and then providing the support, and this phrase that we find helpful, like emotion coaching, which Gottman and others use, which really involves helping young people like name, talk about, reflect, offering understanding, helping them problem solve. And it really is like young people having agency and feeling like this growth mindset about emotions, that I can continue to learn different strategies, different ways, and that it is a learning experience, and that it's a way to connect with others.
I'll just conclude with 2 parting points, and we'll discuss more later. So is that, as with myself, I think for teenagers, emotions are this often kind of random, strange, incomprehensible things that just hit you out of nowhere. And I think one of the messages we want to get across is that you can learn about emotions. You can't always control them, but you can learn to better predict them. There's things you can do to avoid them. And then there's things, emotions can give you a lot of really useful information and energy. And you can use that. That's good stuff. And then I guess the last point is that programs, are better than we found they're much better than schools as context for kids to really learn some of these things about emotions, because of the special environment that programs have. And we can talk more about that later, but they're just really good context for kids to have these direct experiences, as opposed to somebody trying to tell them, which doesn't work very well with emotions. You got to feel emotions to really learn about them. So I'll pass it on to the rest. Ren.
Thank you so much, Reed and Natalie. Panelists, I want to let you know that everybody can see you now. We are all visible. Oh my goodness. Thank you very much. Emotions. Wow. I kept reflecting about my time both in after school programs, but also as a therapist and working with the young people around emotions. And so I'm curious now to hear from our panelists. What did you hear that relates to your work? What sparked a connection? And anybody can start. And I just want to remind you to please let us know a little bit about who you are, where you work, that kind of thing. Who would like to open up?
All right, I'm going in. Here we go. Thank you, Ren. Hi, I'm Bill Fenese. I have been in expanded learning for about 18 years, the last 15 of it. Basically with high school programs or serving older youth. I did start as a middle school site coordinator. I spent a little over 10 years at Pasadena Unified when assets programs first came out, and then moved over to Think Together, where I spent about a little over another 10 years doing their high school programs. And currently I'm a consultant supporting assets programs statewide. So one of the projects I did, and one of the focuses, or foci I should say, I had it toward the end of my time, and it continues on with Think Together, was working on work-based learning and internships, so on and so forth. Working with pathways, linked learning, really trying to make that connection. And I think one thing that I find interesting is, intrinsic motivation. I think Reed spoke in the past a lot about intrinsic motivation. We look at pathways and we look at students with their agency and what do they want to be when they grow up, right? How do we foster that? How do we help that? How do we connect them to all those resources? Because they're intrinsically motivated to be there, right? Which encourages their engagement, right? It amplifies their engagement. So how do we support that? And when we support stuff, as I'm listening to all this, some of the things we do to support, we don't always necessarily tied directly to emotions, right? It's not the first thing that hits us, but we're in fact doing it, right? And the minute that you realize that, then you can add intentionality into what you're doing, right? Sometimes we do some great things by accident, don't realize all that's packed in there. And then once we unpackage it and realize it, then we can make the product even better, and more focused and more effective. So I kind of, there's a lot of things I heard that are really good. I also think that the power, even when we talk about sending students, and I would say that our workspace, our learning space, sometimes isn't at the school anymore. It might be at the job, it might be at the business, or it could in fact be having a role running the after school program itself at the high school, right? Where they have their own self-agency, and what we're doing is just facilitating. They're actually running the program, right? That's where we want to go and want to be. But along the way, and I heard this a lot in what was spoken earlier, we always need to make sure that we're debriefing and pointing out what they're learning and what those emotions are and what those things are along the way. Because often if we don't tell them, they don't know it happened, or they don't have the context with which to understand that. And I think that's critically important. We talk about debriefing the learning, right? Well, if you send them off to an internship site, you give them, and you don't debrief for them what happened or how did it go, there's a lot of emotional learning and things that are completely missing because they may not have realized it or picked it up. However, they do pick up things just naturally on their own and being there. So I don't want to discount that, but I think it really amplifies and magnifies the emotional learning when somebody's there to be able to point it out and help guide them when they struggle or when they do well, right? It's the whole experience itself. And I think if you looked at linked learning, right, itself, which is a big thing going all over the country, component number 4 is personalized student supports. Well, yeah, sure, that could be academic, but most of the time, those are the social emotional supports that they need to be able to be successful and to debrief what they're learning. And in fact, when you hear employers talk about young people or their employees needing better soft skills is accomplishment of social emotional learning. That's what soft skills are. Your degree will get you in the door, it'll get you the job, but your soft skills and your social emotional ability is what's going to advance you in the company, is what's going to move you forward. So hugely critical.
Bill.
Yes, I'll let it go there. I'm sorry.
No, I just wondered if you
Yes.
could tell people what linked learning is for people who are unfamiliar.
Sure. Linked learning is something that's kind of run a big wave in California, is now heading across the country. It's tying young people on a career pathway. Basically, there are 4 components. You have to have the education behind it, right? Your regular school day instruction. You then have career technical education classes, right? So classroom classes where they're giving you content, where they're giving you the background knowledge. And then the last 2 components, 3 and 4, which really fit into our space in expanded learning, is work-based learning experiences. We are the place to be doing work-based learning experiences. They don't have time in the classroom. They're busy, the CTE instructor's busy instructing. They don't get to do the projects and the hands-on things and the things that are connected, which is part of what they need to do. So connecting with the instructional day in CTE would be beneficial to all programs. And again, these students have picked these pathways because they're interested in them. So you have an engagement with which to work from. And then the last pieces I spoke about was the personalized student supports, where most districts and most districts and or schools don't know how they're going to pull that off for all their kids. Well, if they have an assets program or an after school program, they already have it. They just don't know it. And so then again, realizing that and engaging that and making those things intentional really expands greatly the affect, right, and the positivity for the students.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'll stop now. There's a lot we can unpack. I mean,
Okay.
you talk about motivation, bringing people in that have done it, that feed their excitement about it. That's motivating, right? Don't always think about it as emotion, but that's what you're doing when you provide those experiences for them. So I'll use that as an example of something that I didn't always tie together. I know that's what I was trying to do, but it didn't. Right? It didn't occur.
Yeah, thank you. Zamela Ashanti.
I'll hop in. Hello, everyone. My name is Zamela Aziz. I'm the California Regional Director with Girls Leadership. Girls Leadership is an organization that works nationally and globally, and we provide tools and resources directly to youth, but also to youth stakeholders, so teachers, schools, districts, CBOs, to make sure that they have the things available and accessible to equip young girls to really tap into the power of their voice. Thank you again, Reed and Natalie, for all of your work and for sharing all of that. I'm really excited about getting this conversation. Reed, you said something and it reminded me of something that I'm constantly, reminding myself, but also trying to bring into spaces when I'm working with educators or with youth, and that emotions are information and they're important and valuable information. I think that oftentimes, I know even me growing up, we sometimes frame emotion as incapacitating or as something of a deficit. So I think it's really, really important to have conversations about why emotions are important, are valuable, are natural, and again, are just really, really important information. So I'm excited to dive into that conversation. One of the things that came up for me during the share of the findings, and I'm excited to maybe discuss with this larger group, as educators, as folks that are working with youth and in youth development organizations, we are, we're diving into SEL. A lot of us, it's something that we talk about constantly. And I think oftentimes we're diving into the frameworks of what it looks like to bring SEL into spaces as an adult, into youth spaces, but how are we also tapping into our own relationships with emotion? How are we tapping into also, and I'm going to speak really, I really want us to kind of zone in on this too, our own interpretations of emotion. Specifically right now, where, we were asked to come in and talk about, our work, me specifically with girls and girls of color. What are our possible biases when we're thinking about emotions and the way those emotions are exhibited specifically right now? I'm going to talk about with young women of color, with young men of color. And there's some conversation to be had there, and we might only touch the surface of it here. But there's just so much to dive into. And I'm really, really excited to get into it with you all. We have some really great people on the panel. I'm excited to talk to everybody in the participants group. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Ashanti.
Hey, good morning, afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm really excited. I think this is the work that I think I was born to do. I didn't plan to be doing this work. My plan was to be rich. And somehow along the way, the journey towards richness, my heart was like, no, that's not where we're going. And I think I'm hoping that the work that you do, those who showed up here today, and I saw there was teachers and counselors and all different types of roles you play. I hope you feel like you get up every day doing the work that you were put here to do. And I think our kids need that. Our kids deserve that. And so with Reed and Natalie's work, as I was reading through it before, but also hearing them kind of talk about it in person today, one thing I would say that stood out to me was a statement that was about not only Antonio's story. I'm gonna come to Antonio's story in a second, but the idea of how we expect adults or youth to control their emotions. And Mel said it perfectly because I think she said it perfectly. How do we as adults control our emotions? I think oftentimes in the building, the adults often are the most educated and the least emotionally wise, because kids can read when you're talking nonsense. How about that? That's the best way to say it. Like, kids can read through it. And a lot of teachers get upset when a kid calls you out. Oh, you just mad because, and then the teacher gets madder and then kicks the kid out because the kid saw you. They saw that you were being unfair. They saw you were being unjust. They pointed it out to you, and teachers sometimes get upset and afraid of seeing themselves. And here's what I know about young people. If you ever want to test your emotional well-being, hang out with some teenagers. Hang out with some 8-year-olds. Like, they'll tell you what you look like, what you don't look like, how special you are, how not special you are, because their filters of their words are also in development. And we as adults, how quickly have we developed a way of saying, when somebody asks us how we're doing, we say, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm cool. But what do we do if we're not cool, good, or fine? And I think that the emotional work that we're trying to do with young people is giving them tools so that they can take off those emotional masks. My work is connected to masks. We have a movement called the Million Mask Movement. We have a goal of collecting 1 million masks around the world. I never planned to do this. This was not on my list. By right now, according to my calendar, I should already have my house in Oakland Hills, looking at the view. I shouldn't even be working today. I should be just living life. That was my plan. I had worked on a plan. And guess what I get to do today? I get to be in spaces like this because my heart says, this is what you're supposed to be doing. That's what you thought you were going to be doing, but this is what you're supposed to do. And how many kids don't have a place of dreaming what they even want to do? Because you can make a choice to do something different after you've gotten to where you thought you wanted to be. But what if you don't even know where you're going? What if you're just getting up every day and making the day move? And so our work with young people and emotions, what this research talks about is helping. How do we make sure young people know that they can dream, that they got room to dream, no matter what is happening around them? In the midst of all the madness, they can take a breath. They can think about tomorrow. They can think about what I can do next to make things better. And so that's our work. So I'll stop there because, as you can tell, I get excited, and I'm gonna slow down, back off, and I'll be back. Thank you.
Ashanti, can you just tell us where you do the work that you love?
Yeah, so we Ever Forward is we do work all over. We our movement is a global movement, the Million Mask Movement. We do work where our office is based in. We're in Oakland, Hayward. Our physical location is Hayward, but we do most of our work in Oakland, but all around the Bay Area. I mean, our work is during the pandemic, our work moved even more around the world because we had to go digital, or virtual. So people can make masks from around the world, and that's what we invite people to do. So we've collected over 60,000 masks from more than 40 different countries. People are always like going into the site, making masks, and recognizing that there's so much more to us than people can see. When we talk about the masks, for people to know, we're in this new world of masks. So we're talking about emotional masks. The mask is like what I let people see on the outside is the front of my mask, and what's happening behind is behind the mask. And so yesterday we did a workshop. I'm going to show you. I'll show you one of them, and we'll talk probably more about it. But I'll show you one of the masks from yesterday. So this was yesterday. Oh, can you see the words? Yes. So the front of the mask is the left, and the back of the mask is the right. And so what they write on the front is he wrote athletic, Bay Area baby, A and B student. That's what the student wrote on the front. This is a young man, 15 years old. And on the back, he wrote family problems, tired, and hungry. And that's just one, for example. But what students recognize when they begin to do this is that there's more to them than anybody can see by looking at them. and there's more to people we see than what meets our eyes. And so, yeah, so our work is all over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Natalie and Reed, did you have any responses to anything that our panelists said?
I mean, I'll try and be very choosy. Everything they said was so useful. Bill, the idea of debriefing and validating, because kids get into, a lot of time kids get overwhelmed by really complicated situations, but they don't know they're complicated. Adult has to come along and say, that was really a hard situation you were in. Adults were telling you this, somebody else was telling you this. And so validating their emotions and then validating their attempts to learn about emotions. Amel, I really liked the kind of call for research on and understanding and thinking about women of color, men of color as being really important topics. We can't assume that. I mean, I grew up in a very privileged background and don't have, I think it's important to understand people who have stress and prejudice that they're trying to deal with. And yeah, and Ashanti talked about purpose as being really important. I think that emotions are often driven by purpose, and purposes, using emotions can be about purpose. So really great comments, and I'll stop there. Oh, the adults part was great too.
I say that Thea was asking about how important is it to be explicit about in the questions about talking about emotions with staff that you're working with, and Bill responding. That was really important. I thought it was really interesting that Ashanti's example of having a concrete, I love like creative activity where you're acknowledging right there that you might show the world, like what do the people see? What do they not see that's going on with me? Situations which obviously have emotions associated, and like as a way to reflect for yourself, but also understand for, having understanding and building that understanding of others' perspective. So I just think these examples of being in workplace and what Amel is saying of different cultural, like what assumptions are we making about people's emotions? So I'm interested to hear more examples too, because I feel like these examples are really helpful.
Thanks.
I think one thing that was discussed when you all talked about Antonio's situation, when you talked about like Antonio and suspending the curriculum, I think that for me is something that resonated, because what I was clear about whenever Forward first started, I was a first year teacher. I was not trying to start a nonprofit. I didn't think you could get more nonprofit than teaching, first of all, but I was definitely not trying to start one. And then while I'm trying to do this work, I'm trying to find, how do I get money? And they said, well, you got to apply for money. I'm like, well, how do you get money? They said, well, apply for grants. Then you go to the grants and they're like, well, you need data. I'm like, what data? I'm just mentoring young people in my classroom. And they're like, well, you got to get a nonprofit status. How you do that? You got to go fill out this book to get this status, to then apply for money, to then tell people. And there was all these work you had to do just to do the work. And I realized, I'm not collecting data. I'm meeting with young people every week. We're having lunch. We need money. And I think what ends up happening is I wasn't creating a curriculum. I wasn't trying to create an organization. I was a teacher who saw a need. And what happens a lot of times with the structure of how our systems work is that then you have to go and become a business person, and then you take your mind and your energy off of the work. And I think I imagine as you all did the research, you found organizations who you then got to do. The person who started it probably is sometimes get so disconnected from the work that they're in their office taking paperwork and writing grants that you take away from the work. And I know that that's been the hardest part for me, moving from the practitioner. Like I was in a workshop yesterday, you know what I'm saying? That's why I'm in this work. I'm not really in this work to be sitting in an office, I want to be in the work. And I think I have a big dream. So when you dream big, you then have to see, how do I scale, right? People, that's what the big word in business is, right? But and it runs into nonprofits too. How are you going to scale this idea? What? Have you ever tried to get 1,000 kids together I mean, anyway, you can let me get started. Anyway, I'm just saying. So the work that we got to do in this work with young people is recognize that we got to find the people who are passionate about it, give them the tools so they can do the work. So then, and provide the support. So I think the writings that they like, I can't write like them. So when Natalie and Reed writes articles like this, like it's like it gives me some muscle to go into a school and say, hey, look at this research. If you want to know why this is so important, look at this research. Like I don't have the time to be trying to write you a document of why it's important if you don't get it. And there's unfortunately some educators who don't get it. There's some teachers who really get it, but the people who they got to go to get the money to do the thing don't get it. And then they have to try and convince somebody, oh no, we need to focus on academics. Why would you give a kid who's horrible at math 2 math classes when they're failing everything? I mean, I get it. I get the rationale, but why haven't we talked to this kid about what's in the way? What's the barriers? What's outside of math that's causing him not to be academically doing so well? And I think that we as schools are sadly in another way failing in that way. So yeah, thanks for that part.
Ashanti, you said something earlier, which was give an 8-year-old, hang around with some 8-year-olds and they'll tell you exactly what's going on. And so when I was working with young people as a therapist, I had a deck, those charts that have emotions on them with faces, right? I had a deck of cards. They were round cards like this. They had a bunch of emotions on them. And then I cut out a bunch of other empty, just plain circles. And I used to use these in my practice all the time. And I was using it with younger kids. And then I was like, teenagers need this. And so I started using it with teenagers. And then I started using them with adults. Everybody needs them. But one of the beautiful things about these cards is that oftentimes they'd be laid out on the ground or a table, and kids would say, teens would say, adults would say, I don't see the one that I am. And so they would make their own. They would make faces of their own. So it is super helpful in supporting. All of us need to identify what is the emotional, what is the emotion we're feeling, but then what are the qualities of it? And they're very different. You can be angry in a number of different ways. And then Amel, you said something about what are the assumptions we're making about expressions of emotions, particularly around youth of color. And just recently, somebody, a colleague of mine an African-American colleague of mine brought to my attention that I was using language. It was very gentle conversation. They were pointing something out to me, that I was using words that were highly triggering to her as an African-American woman, that I was wholly unaware of. And she asked me, please, first, don't make assumptions about me. That was the first thing. And the second thing was, when you use this word, that it's not playing with me, and it's creating a reaction. So yeah, there's a whole lot of learning to do around all of that.
So I think one thing here that I'm hearing throughout all of this that's really, really important, I don't think we've named it yet, but it's relationships, right? I mean, to be able to do this work, you have to have a relationship with the other person. You can't just come up to somebody cold and go, hey, and the deeper or better the relationship is, the more effective you can be in working with youth, right? Because you know them personally better, you know some of the things. The more you're in a certain environment, maybe to Ren's point a little bit, you pick up some things and you realize some things of the culture of that high school or that environment that you're in that you can apply to these things. I think of it, and I think too, especially right now, I probably wouldn't have said this 5 years ago. but acknowledging what they see as being real or not real, right? There's a lot of falsehoods flying around these days, right? I think we all realize that. But when a student sees something and they come to you and they say, this is what I see, a lot of adults will go, oh, that's just, they give them what I like to call the okey doke answer, right? Oh, well, that teacher's not this, that teacher's not that. I can give you an example where I had a teacher teaching biology who the only students she threw out of her class were the A student Black girls. Black girls with A students. That's who she threw out of the class. She didn't throw anybody else out of the class. Now I think that's a little odd, right? But it was a pattern. And then what you come to find out in the pattern is anytime one of those students asked her a question, a very good question about the subject material, somehow this woman felt threatened or somehow she felt they were challenging her and she threw them out of class. So when they come to me and say, I think I have to go, well, I have to, I mean, don't tell anybody else I told you this, right? Because it won't be popular on school. But the truth is, you're right. That's who she throws out. I think you're absolutely correct. And then we change the conversation to how are we going to deal with that, right? What can we change? What can't we change? How are we going to get you in a good place to deal with that? And how can we use those examples moving forward when you encounter this again? Because I doubt this will be the last time you will encounter this type of thing. And so having that conversation and going deeper, but it does take a relationship, right? They have to come up and ask you. But I think acknowledging that what they see is real is hugely important in this day and time. I don't think it's ever not been important, but in this day and time, I think it's more important because they really want to know. They want to. And let's face it, what you see is what you see. And we were taught when I was a young guy, you should believe what you see, right? Nowadays, you're taught sometimes not to believe what you see, and they're struggling for that, right? And I think based on how that goes, so go their emotions.
Can I jump in? I guess I wanted to just kind of go back through what we just discussed, which is Ren was talking about experience with students. And there's a sense we've found that emotions are kind of a royal road to discovery, that they kind of store a lot of your past experience. And by, as he said, by admitting you're mad, then it's, well, like, what are you mad at? Unpacking that, and in some cases being corrected in terms of the way you're thinking about it. And I definitely agree with Bill, that it is all about relationships. Let me just first say that peers can be really helpful when kids are working together. The kind of reinforcement and validation they get from them are important, and that peer part often doesn't get discussed, but having a group where they're all committed to each other and to being high functioning in that relationship is powerful. But then the adults with their kind of longer foresight are just really key. But if they don't trust you, they tell us like, oh, well, I just ignore everything he says. I don't trust him. And they need to have that feeling of safety and that you care.
Reed, you also mentioned about, Natalie too, you also mentioned about challenge in a project and how that can provide a lot of opportunity when there's challenge. And I was reminded about two things. One is I worked in a program where at the end of the year, we took everybody who was in the program, middle schoolers, for a camping trip. And here we are in Northern California, the Bay Area, where it doesn't rain in June. And we went on this camping trip and we did not bring anything that was rain related at all, because it doesn't rain. It's particularly not in June. And when we got to where we were going and we set up camp, somebody came running down the hill and said, oh my gosh, there's a huge storm brewing. And we were like, a what? A storm? And it was torrential downpour, torrential. And however, the young people worked together to do everything that we needed to do, make the food, put up a makeshift, tent so that you could cook and get people fed, and all of our grand plans for this closing weekend that we had for these young people, where we all went out the door, right? Everything. We couldn't do anything we had planned. It rained the entire weekend. But this opportunity to work together through this challenge, made it, I'm sure, memorable. It's memorable to me to this day. I'm sure it's memorable for them. The other experience I had that relates to peers supporting each other is we took my daughter and two of her friends and their mothers on a rite of passage trip. And it was a backpacking trip. And the second to last day before we were done with, it was pretty strenuous, purposefully strenuous. One of the young people said, I want to go back. I don't want to stay out another day. So it was a big crisis moment. And the adults kind of looked at each other and we said, well, we'll just walk away, see what happens here. And listening in, this is what they did for the person who didn't want to continue on. They gave her a scale. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you want to go back now? 5 being, I want to go back now. And that's what she said, 5. And somebody said to her, what could we do to make it a 4? What could we do to make it a 3? And so they literally worked with her for about an hour to brainstorm ideas to make it okay to stay out one more night. So it was beautiful. Exactly. The peer piece is really important. Don't be shy, people. You're muted, Ashanti.
Oh no, I was actually, I saw a mail. I was actually.
I saw you and I was like, I saw you.
Oh man. Well, no, I think I love taking kids outdoors. I think outdoors is a really important piece. I think when we talk about I guess one of the stories that rings true to me around outdoors, and I'm glad that they had that scale that worked for those students. I've had scenarios where the scales didn't work, but what I'd recognize that when students are out of their comfort zone, I think one of the questions that came up in the Q&A was about like how important it is for adults, for the staff to like be trained about emotions, about what emotions are. Maybe try this. Like for those that are here in the room or they're in the attending, if you could think about yourself as just a being, an emotional being, human, like if you could think about like your own mask, like what are the parts of yourself that's easy to let your students see in your program? And maybe you could just use one word if you have to, and what is the things that are harder to let students see? Because when I was a teacher, and if you could write that in the chat, you could just write like easy or hard. You could write front or back. Like we use the term front mask, back of mask. What I was taught when I was becoming a teacher is by my older teachers was like, hey, you keep all your problems in the glove compartment. And then when you go to work, you have no problem. You're a problem-free human. And then when you go home, you can pick your problems back up and take them back with you. So it was a training to teachers. It was like a statement, but it was almost like, don't come to school with your problems. So kids, you come in class and you're trying to be like you're superhuman, which we are always almost expected to be as educators. And whether you're an after-school educator or you're a daytime educator, we're all educators, right? So, and you're supposed to act that way. But if we haven't dealt with our own emotions in good ways, they're waiting for the right moment. They're waiting for the middle schooler to tell you that your shoes are horrible, and you as an adult, listen. Do I really care what a 12-year-old says? No. But if you ever have a 12-year-old in the middle of the cafeteria tell you about your shoes and have 30 middle schoolers laughing at you, I'll tell you from experience, it feels horrible. I was like, I think I want to oh, wait a minute, what? Okay, he's just 12. Like my brain went into like back, I was in middle school again, feeling the pressure of like, what the heck? Now I'm an adult. I got degrees. I got a job. I got a career. Like it would be not wise for me to act like a 12-year-old. But guess what? Emotions don't care what age you are. If you're not dealing with them in healthy ways, they will come back and they will smack somebody emotionally, verbally, physically. And you probably 3 seconds later realize, oh, I should not have done that, said that, made that, whatever happens. What happens is if we don't help our adults recognize how to navigate their own emotions, then it's going to spill out on the kids. And guess what? Today, more than ever, we're in a different time of schooling than we were 2 years ago, right? Like it's January. Everyone's like, yay, New Year's resolutions. And we're trying to figure out, well, how we getting back to school? California, we're struggling. Bay Area, we're struggling. We got schools at 60% capacity. Kids are out. We got COVID waves. It's a lot going on. And teachers are tired and exhausted. And then they're supposed to be superhuman as well. I mean, it's like telling Superman, hey, do your job with a kryptonite thing around his neck and be like, hey, you should still be able to fly. What's wrong with you? Why you can't fly? And we wouldn't expect a superhero to be able to survive that. Why do we expect teachers and educators to be able to navigate chaotic, trying situations and not have a emotional burden and so a heaviness? And so our work with Ever Forward, as much as we started with young people, we're working with teachers now is even more critical right now. And here's what I know: a lot of schools came back really focusing more on how we're gonna make sure kids have a stockpile of sanitizer and masks and arrows on the hallway of which way they should walk down the hall, as opposed to how we're going to support them around their emotional baggage that they've collected over how many ever months they were home. And look, some kids went home to homes that were beautiful and loving and caring. Some kids loved that time off, and some kids wasn't the case. And so I think when schools brought kids back without having some emotional work, I mean, some schools like, we're going to take the first week and do some team building. Well, that's what you would do during a regular school year. You would take a week. You need almost a month of community building, team building. And what we did, we didn't do that. Well, some schools did. If you're a school who did it, I want to know you. I want to learn about you. Here's what most schools did. They came back to business as usual, 6 classes a day. Put your backpack over there, sit down, don't talk to, put your mask back on, and all the perfunctory behaviors and not supporting young people around their emotions. And I think as we see on the news, you saw it, you see it, wherever you live. If you don't watch the news, probably good. Don't look at social media. You will see the behaviors over and over again of what's happening when we don't deal with it and we don't deal with emotions in healthy ways. And so I'm glad we're having these conversations. I think, as you can tell, I'm excited about it and I'm passionate about it. And so thank you.
I wanted to, go ahead, Emil.
I just wanted 2 things, Ashanti. One, I have never been so critical of the shoes that I wear until I worked with middle schoolers. So I am like just hyper aware, make sure everything is because they will drag you across the floor. So it was a little triggering, you talking about our ability. And then the other thing, I really hope that if we leave with anything from this conversation, it's us really taking the time to step back and understand that this type of a conversation, what it requires us to do is really challenge our own understandings of what it means to work with young people and learn what it means for a young person to learn, for a young person to be successful. And oftentimes, I think I accidentally muted myself, like you were sharing, Ashanti. This is just really the prime example, everything that we've been, our young people have been experiencing these past couple of years. We've asked for young people and for adults to go back to business as usual. We're now more than ever, it's all the more critical that we're really like taking a step back and saying, is business as usual really what's needed right now? What do our young people need? What do our adults need at this moment? And it's gonna be a challenge. It's gonna be hard. We've been doing education and learning and youth development the same way for years. So challenging that is not going to be easy, not just with ourselves, but with other stakeholders, with institutions that we're within. So what does it look like to really push that and say, you know what, maybe right now we're not going to have this assignment due just yet. Maybe I can yield some flexibility here. Maybe I can, challenge the way that I'm perceiving a young person's emotions in this moment. A young person may be quiet. Is this really defiance? Am I seeing it? Like, am I interpreting it as defiance? How am I able to really recognize these things that our young people are going through, that our colleagues are going through, that I'm going through, and really change expectations, change what our supports are in those moments. And that might mean that, we might need to have some flexibility with deadlines and deliverables and our expectations. But ultimately, I think that having that yields, and we see it, and we see it in the work that you put together, Reed and Natalie, yields to better outcomes for our young people. So it's work, but I think it's necessary work.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the ecology of emotions in a program, and we wrote about the psychology, but there's also the sociology of, like, every day when a program meets, whether it's online or not, you have all these youth who are coming, bringing emotions with them, and they have different things, and then the adults, and they play off of each other. They may piss each other off, or they may find each other. You have adults that might have different levels of vulnerability. There may be some days in which it doesn't bother you about, they're teasing you about whatever. Junior high kids, I was a school bus driver, they can really be a lot of fun. But the adults' emotions, and if you're the only adult there, it can be really hard. And so we have the system of emotions that's changing every day, and COVID has made those system dynamics so much harder because you don't get to see, you can't pull youth aside quite as easily. And so I don't have solutions for all that, but I think it's important to think at that level. And programs we've seen that are really kind of pay a lot of attention to emotions, and I'm sure many of you have done this, is the program might start with some kind of ritual. I've seen, where they have as Ren did with us, have us all relax a little bit, or give students a chance to sort of check in and kind of share something that's on their mind, and just some of that mindfulness. And some of them may also then have if that's kind of unzipping, they might have a zipping back up at the end, just to kind of reflect on what happened. And then in terms of staff, we studied outward bound programs where, they're out in the woods for 4 weeks at a time, and the relationship between the co-instructors was just really important to the mental health, because they're dealing with a lot of stress. The adults are stressed in this wild, and then they're trying to deal with the kids. And by working together, giving each other space and time and validation for something that they thought they did wrong, or a moment that they missed, building in those kinds of things during the program or afterwards. And that's much harder to do probably with COVID, but trying to think, and hopefully our funders give us enough money to be able to build in kind of mental health, or chances for staff to not unload about something they did where they felt awful, or how could I do it different? How can we learn from that? I felt like it was okay, but I missed a golden opportunity. I think those kinds of conversations, if we can really treasure them and build them in at those different levels of the ecology, are important.
I saw that Steve was asking about the question about saying more about helping youth use emotion. I guess I wanted to say more about how we found out that youth were doing that. I knew about researchers who were really trying to highlight that like even so-called negative emotions are like, yeah, very adaptive, and that people use them to motivate themselves. Like they kind of like, you need to make a really difficult phone call. Sometimes you like, people will get themselves angry to like, get up that energy and like, what am I trying to say and what's, bothering me, and channel it. So anyway, I knew about that research, but I think we just asked young people like, in this program, have you experienced, and we asked about specific questions, like, have you experienced, say, anger or frustration? We also asked about, like, we would ask about a specific emotion and then say like, then tell us about it, what caused that, what happened, how did you deal with it? And then, then we asked them like, yeah, how did you learn about it? Like, what did you do? What advice would you give to other youth if they're experiencing something like this? And then we just decided to ask, like, we weren't sure what would happen, but say like, is it useful to feel this way? Is it useful at all? And I think we're just like the depth of which so many young people said, actually, it's helpful because in the future, you're going to deal with this. Or it made me like, the worry actually made me work harder, as long as you don't worry too much. So they started talking about that. It's like, you're too worried, it gets in the way, but if you're not, so they were coming up with all these things that like researchers are trying to figure out about using emotions. And a lot of the youth once asked, like, you're walking them through, like, what was the situation experienced? And then like, how did you deal with it? What caused it? But then asking, is it useful? What advice would you give to other youth? And they had such great, so like being able to like acknowledge that these so-called negative emotions are actually like, like Ashanti and others are saying, like that those are important signals about situations in our lives, and having them like help us understand like how can that experience or that energy or the attention that it's causing you, shifting your attention, but like how are there ways to use that, to help, like even to express it to others about what's going on, or to, communicate it in some way, or to help others who are going through something similar. So yeah, how can they, and again, I think it's really learning from them. And that's what we were doing, was just learning from asking from their experience, how they saw it and how would they help others with it. They were so insightful about that.
There's occurs to me that there's another way when we're talking about using emotion, is that when not only young people, but also adults, when we are able to share from our experience what is happening to us emotionally, and find that there are others that are having the same kind of emotional experience, then together, and this goes back to Sean Ginwright and healing-centered engagement, then together we can look for the cause or causes of what's causing the the emotion, and then it becomes politicized. Then we make it political, because we begin to see that it's not just an emotional reaction in isolation, but it's happening to a group of people. And so then we can get motivated to act and begin to change things on a larger level. So one of the things that I'm curious to know is, Ashanti, a lot of your work has been with boys or male-identified kids, and Amel, you are working with girls or female-identified teens. And I have noticed that we haven't characterized emotions as specific to gender. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So one of the things I realized, and I realized I had not characterized it, is I want us as a society, community, people to normalize that emotions are human. And I think that my work started with young men in my classes because I was a first-year teacher. Remember, mind you, I'm trying to give people context when I talk about this work. The reason I'm so passionate about this work, when I left my engineering career, like I came to a teaching career fully heartfelt, passionate, like, and I was failing. I was doing a horrible job. Like I think I'm smart. And I had smart kids in my class failing algebra. And I'm like, you can't, this is not what's, and I didn't think they were failing because they couldn't do the math. I thought most times they were failing because they were not even trying really hard. Now, if you tell me you're trying, I want to believe you, but you haven't even opened the book yet. You know what I'm saying? So my work was like, help me see what I'm missing. And here's what I knew. And the reason I wrote that question in the chat, I said, sometimes the magic question was, what am I missing? Like, you're so smart. I can tell you're smart, but you're not showing. And what I learned from the young men in my class was that in that community, smart's not cool. Like, I'm not going to be no nerd, no geek, no teacher's pet. And so therefore, because smart's not cool and you want to be cool, you better not be friends with a teacher. What? Now, because I had forgotten by the time I started teaching what it was like to be in high school, I had forgotten that there was a time in my life when I pretended like I wasn't smart. I forgot there was a time in my life where I pretended like what? Like, I remember Miss BP in middle school, like, I could read. My mom made sure I could read. I would like time myself so I could go to the bathroom because she was calling people to read. So I could go to the bathroom, stay in there for about 5-10 minutes and come back after she passed my seat because I didn't want to read. Because it's hard to fake that you can't read really good. Like, it's kind of hard. It's like, and I would do it. I would be like missing words and skipping words. And because there was a stigma in my community about what it meant to be too smart. And so I knew what that felt like. And so because as an adult by that time, you know, I had forgotten that I had pretended for most of my life. Like, the reason I think I became a really good teacher is because I was a really bad student at some points in my life. And that's how I became a good student. I knew what a bad student got. I knew how a good student got treated. And I liked the way good students got treated. And so when I became a good student, I was like, I'm gonna stay on this side because that other side is a little bit a little bit too much attention on me. I think the good students get less attention than the bad students. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But what I will say is that part of my work around young men is like giving them a space to recognize that they're human first. And then they live in this body that they live in, that however they identify in that body, but that we all feel. And I think that we've taught our emotions out of our boys and young men. And we have men who don't think that boys should even talk about emotions. There's men who say, what, are you trying to make men into women? No one ever said that. Because if you hear that, then you have been programmed to think that for a man to have emotions makes him not masculine, not a man, and therefore those behaviors get passed down. And so my work has been giving young men a space to say, look, if you feel it is real, you may have been trained that you shouldn't feel it, but you do. And so what do we do with that cognitive dissonance in your mind that says, well, I'm feeling sad about this, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of behaviors that show up in our communities. I mean, if you look at I don't do a lot of statistics, but let's say one, there are 94% of people who are incarcerated are men. 94%. Now, I don't think, do you think that men are 9 times as evil, bad humans as women? I think we all have our flaws, but why are men filling up our jails? Well, something could be said about the fact that if you train a person to not feel, then any behavior I do is accepted because I don't even feel it. That's evil. That's evil, sadness, fear, like all those emotions, I stuff them and I just operate based on not feeling what I feel. So I think that that's how our work started. And and our work continues to grow around it, right? Around these masks. And the reason we use the mask is a good metaphor just for having those easy conversations with a student, with an adult, with a teacher. When a teacher and student have a conflict, okay, what are we missing here? Well, to tell me what you're upset about. What am I missing? Here's what you said, but I think I'm missing something. And when I can help you dig past what you said into the feeling of what you're feeling, there's oftentimes the teacher having just as big feelings as the 12-year-old. And if the adult is acting like a 12-year-old, it makes it harder to have a good conversation. But our job is, so when I was an administrator, was to help pull back the layers of this conversation because we're not going to get to it. So thank you for that. And Amel, I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Shanti. Yeah, I mean, what comes up for me, similar to what you opened up with, Ashanti, emotions are, again, we've been echoing that for this whole conversation, but they're human, they're natural. and they're information. They are important and valuable information. And it's funny because it's not funny, but about a week ago, I was sitting in on one of our webinars, and we asked, this was actually a group of adult women, and we asked them growing up, what were some of the emotions they were expected to exhibit growing up in school. And their responses were polite, kind, quiet. And these were things that were celebrated and embraced for them as young women. And when I think about emotions as they relate to women, to young girls, we're being asked to suppress them. So often we're being told, you're too emotional. Why are you being so emotional? Again, we're seeing emotion as deficit, it's incapacitating, it's something that, is just bad. When in reality, again, it's just a very important and valuable thing that we are all currently in this conversation exhibiting some sort of emotion. And, sometimes they're more heightened or a little bit more, kind of dormant, but we're all exhibiting some sort of emotion at this very moment. And again, what we're seeing with young girls is that they're expected to suppress that they're told they're too emotional. One of the things that also came up for me too, and this was in another conversation we were having earlier this week, when girls are exhibiting emotion, and sometimes when they're a little bit more heightened, they're often penalized. And we see this more often with girls of color. Girls of color are about 6 times more likely to be suspended from school as white girls. And when we think about, and one of the things that actually came up too was really interesting too, was that it's things that we would celebrate as forms of leadership, coming from an organization, we're talking about girls' leaderships, that we would celebrate as forms of leadership, like speaking out, for a young Black girl might be perceived as defiance, might be perceived as, challenging authority. And so this is what I came up when it's fresh in my mind, is conversations that we've had, and we're talking about the ways that we exhibit emotion and the biases that we might hold as adult leaders when we're working with young people, to really be able to check that and regulate that. And what does that mean? What are my reactions to the emotions that young people are bringing into spaces? And do I hold biases when I hear it from a boy versus a girl, or from a Black girl versus a white girl? Like, being able to really kind of take a really critical lens. Is there a particular emotion that a young person exhibits that's really triggering for me? I know for me, one of the big things that was like, just, was screaming. Like it was like the biggest trigger whenever I was working directly with youth. If I heard screaming, my emotions would just rile up, my blood would boil. And it was something I had to learn to regulate for myself working with young people, because that is a behavior exhibited, rooted out of an emotion, whether it be excitement and joy or fear, that behaviors are results of emotion. And so that was something that me as an adult, I had to personally regulate, because it was something I grew up, I was told I couldn't scream because my parents thought something bad was happening. And so that was what I was bringing into into programs that I was working at. So that for me was something that I had to hold critical lens to and to regulate as well. So yeah, there's just so much to talk about. And I'm appreciating just having this conversation with you.
Thanks, Amal. Ashanti put in chat for the attendees, what's your magic question or strategy to help students unpack emotions? And there's some great responses here. And one of the things that I see here is that Gustavo says is that it's a little hard to peel back the layers. Every student is different. Layers can be thin or they can be rock hard.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Gustavo and Brandon and Alex for answering that question. I think, when I asked it, and first of all, I want to thank Amel, thank you very much for that, because you got me start thinking about the movie Push Out. You got me start thinking about like I grew up, I was the oldest, so I had a sister. And so I was raised by a single mother. So I knew how to navigate emotions and watch for emotions. And I was very aware as a young kid, and I was raising kids as a kid. So all that to say, thank you for speaking for the challenge that people have, and I think it can go back. I mean, this is not a. I mean, it's almost like you can't ignore certain conversations in certain conversations, right? We want to be like, oh, this is just about after school, and this is just about emotions. But we must understand where we live, and if you watch any much of the news, and if you watch how people are easily able to dismiss people who they don't want to hear from, who they don't want to acknowledge, and I think that's. I mean, this past Monday was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, right? Like there's historical connection to not only how our schools operate, how our country operates, how our world operates. And oftentimes we see there are people among us, and this is we're in California, I'm in California. So there are people in California who would want to pretend as if none of that matters. You should just work hard, and then you can achieve greatness, and don't worry about the other stuff, because that happened a whole lot of years ago. You don't, it's almost bewildering as if intelligent adults use that logic. And we wonder why our schools continue to operate like they did 100 years ago. What other industry looks like it did 100 years ago and we expect it to work well? A teacher in the front of the room, students in rows, teacher spewing information. In a couple of weeks, you're going to give me the information back. What? And then for the innovative schools out there, I'm excited because you found that doesn't always work. And so how do we begin to recognize that not only in the school time, but in the after school and the extra time of work of trying to help young people grow, we got to do some work around that. And so our work has been, how do we navigate that with not only teachers, educators, parents, community, because we all have to come to a place of recognizing that if we don't do something with these emotions in a healthy way, they're coming back. I was saying the other day that energy is, emotions are energy in motion, right? And so if emotions are energy in motion, what happens? Well, it goes somewhere. So something happens, like I received something, I saw something, I experienced something, somebody said something to me, that energy came to me. I'm now taking that energy and I'm gonna make a judgment of what it was. Maybe it came to me as anger and I turned it into a joke. Whatever, I did something with it. But what if I take it in and I don't talk about it? What if I take it in and I store it? How much can I store, and where does it go? And when I store it in my body somewhere. It's waiting for the moment, right? And so what we hear about it. We hear about it with lots of people. They took out something on somebody else, and it wasn't even them. It was the 20 other things they didn't deal with in a healthy way. They came out rushing. And for the teachers who are educators, it's hard. It is, because sometimes our kids may not even trust that you really want to hear. Like, nah, Mr. Gustavo, you just saying that. You're gonna try to get me in trouble. I ain't telling you what happened, right? You only here for this check. Anybody ever heard that? I think sometimes when kids tell adults that in work and schools, I was clear. I was actually a little bit offended when you told me I was here for this check when I was a teacher. So I would show them as a math teacher. I thought it was a good math lesson. I would show them my engineering check and my teacher check. And I'm like, please help me understand what human would leave that for this. But that's probably pretty immature. But that's what I did as a teacher, right? But what I'm clear about is that if we don't help young people know how to navigate their emotions and know that, look, I'm here to support you, and I'm not here to try and make it worse for you. But guess what? There are certain things that a kid will tell you that will make it worse for them before it gets better. If a kid is dealing with abuse, and like when they tell somebody, that adult who may be a mandatory reporter, it may get worse for that kid before it gets better. So to tell the kid, I'm not going to make it worse for you, could also be not true. And they tell you, and then what happens? Now they're removed from their family. Like, there's so many things and complexities in our work as adults with kids, is that we want them to trust us, but we also want to take care of them in a good way. Those are big decisions and big things that we have to deal with when they finally start to confide in us as adults. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. There's a question from Sam that he says, so much to talk about. How do we make time with staff? How do we do this and when? And then right now it's about 11:44. And so I wanted just to open it up to the attendees as well and say, if you're interested in asking a question, getting your voice into the space with us, you can raise your hand and I can make it so that you can speak. But what do we think about this question from Sam? How do we make time with staff to talk about it? When? And what are we doing? What are we saying to them?
You know, Ren, I think I somewhat answered it when I answered Sam's last question. I think it has a lot to do with role modeling and giving examples to staff, right? They can read about it, they can do this and that, but what is their knowledge of the context of that? When you're a leader in an after-school program in this particular setting, the way you handle things, the way you role model that for them, the way you explain why you do what you do, what your intentionality is. I don't know if you can sit them down in the chair and go, okay, this is how it works. I think it's a process, and I think you have to walk them through that. And I'm a firm believer, and oftentimes, unfortunately, it starts with the site coordinator, not the people above them. It tends to be very hierarchical, right? Whereas when we get down to our program, it's less, sure, somebody has that job, but it's more of a cascading thing, right? How am I supposed to learn how to do something if the person above me who wants me to do it has never given me the example of how that goes, right? So it may be, unfortunately, the site coordinator that starts it there. But when they're working with their staff and they're good at it and they're intentional about it, and they're explaining what they're doing, why they do what they do to their staff as staff is there, because you can't teach them in a day, then that can cascade down to how you want them to work with the students, right? So you really, when you're a site coordinator, you're in that level, you're working with two levels of young people. You're working with the levels of young people who have emotions, who are coming into your space, who are the ones that are leading your students, who again, also need that support. So in my mind, it's a very cascading thing. It has a lot to do with role modeling. It has a lot to do with explaining why one does what they do and what the intentionality is. I think more than giving a class or, you know what I mean, or handing somebody something to read. I think it's really a lot about, well, to the point of this thing, experiential learning, right? Where do we learn the best? I know I do. Experiential learning. Well, part of this is experiential learning on how to work with kids, how to work with their emotions, how to work with your staff, which is all very experiential learning, and is always, I think, the most powerful learning. But experiential learning doesn't happen in a book. You don't sit and do rote material and send it back to the teacher, to Ashanti's point. You have to get in with both feet and you have to do it. That would be my take on it. And by the way, when I worked with middle school and high school kids, we had the school colors of yellow and green, which are probably the worst on the face of the planet. And I would purposely, which were hard to find shoes that were really crazy in yellow and green so that they would laugh at my shoes. So I just want you, that's how I would break the ice with some of those kids. So I had a different take on the shoe thing.
When it's intentional, it's good. When it's not planned is when it's the shock. That's what I agree.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bill. And I feel like it's kind of when we talk about time, and it's just so limited. And when I think of the world of just after school, you know, we're doing so much with so little, and one of those things is time. And so I think it's really finding the opportunities to just have it embedded into every facet of your program. Your interactions with your staff and families, how are you incorporating it into your schedule? You know, and it might be in some very subtle, not obvious ways, but thinking of the ways that you can embed it again into your day-to-day and support staff into embedding in the day-to-day. Bill, you mentioned this is cascading. So I'm going to encourage folks, you know, you might not be in direct, if you're not in direct service, or if you're supporting folks in direct service, how are the ways that you can provide space for people to actually take advantage of that time to really kind of pace out days in their work so that they're able to embed and incorporate structures and systems that really support, you know, spaces where we can dive into this emotional learning with young people.
Natalie and Reed, do you have an idea about that, or what have you seen in terms of how programs are creating space to support staff with understanding this?
Well, I think Reed talked about this, like what are rituals? I know one of the programs where youth were leading activities for other youth, at the end of each day, they were reflecting. What did you notice? How did you feel? And again, sometimes reframing something they didn't think went well, but it's like, oh, but you know, let's look at this. And so starting to see, like, even if I felt this way, there's another way to see it, and other people might have seen it differently. And that kind of continual, like, each day they start seeing, oh, different things, or what are they noticing about others' emotions. And I think, like I said, the theater program, I've been really interested in that, from Reed's work and seeing, my relative, and just how that they build in a lot of processing and expressing of emotion, in theater programs. And what Reed had written also, it really intrigued me, of like, each programs have their different emotional maybe signatures in different programs. Like, when is there, like, when casting is done in a theater program, there's a lot of disappointment, excitement. How do you deal with that? What are ways, what are, so both where are spaces, but what are also activities, like the mask activity? I'm just very fascinated and really want to follow up on that. Like you're saying, Ashanti, for both staff, it's a way of acknowledging, it's a concrete way you're making time for that, and you're acknowledging that people can feel one way and show it a different way, that other things are going on that people might not notice. And so, and then it's like, oh, might we do this for youth? So like, how do we incorporate activities also where this is just a natural part of it? So I think it's really interesting just to see all the ways that programs already have these, spaces, but then also what are activities we can bring into a program that really kind of acknowledge and work with that.
One of the things that I've noticed is that working with staff people who are working with young people is they say to me oftentimes, there is a level of fear in terms of opening up emotional spaces. And the fear has to do not with what the young person is going to tell them, but what they are supposed to do. They feel like their job is to do something, to fix something. And so how do we support staff people in understanding what their role is when there are big emotions in the room?
One of the things we talk about in our work with young people, and definitely what we know young people tell us, there's a video with a young man, I just shared it right there. He talks about, you know what, it wasn't about masculinity. It was that I didn't have nobody to talk to. Like I didn't trust people. Like, what am I going to do? I'm not going to know therapists. How are they going to fix it? Because we sometimes, and I've seen this happen with adults. Now that I'm an outsider coming into schools, I often see adults are often more afraid of the mask than kids are. I've had probably way more adults in the back of the PD than I have teenagers who are like, if nothing else, they'll try at least scribble some words on it, right? I think oftentimes, and it's probably just societal, I don't know how to describe it, but if we think the only reason we should talk about things we're going through is if the person we're talking to can fix it, we would probably not talk about many things, which is what we often see. When people say, how you doing? You say, fine. Why? Maybe you don't even think about the answer. Maybe fine is just your normal response. I'm good. Everything's cool. I'm all right. But how are you really doing? Well, oh, I didn't know you really wanted to know, right? Because oftentimes we're getting into the perfunctory habits of just society and people and being and community. And so the question for us is always, in our work, young people know that when I ask you how you're doing, it's probably gonna be a follow-up. If you don't, and I think it makes it harder for me sometimes to have conversations with people because they say, how you doing? And I'm trying to like not say fine. And then when I say good, I'm like, well, am I actually good? And I have to ask myself, okay, is this a situation where I just need to fake it? Okay, because I got masks too. I know how to use my masks. Yeah, this is a situation where everything needs to be good and fine and cool. All right. And then I'm asking my kids, oh, is this a real conversation? Or do we have time for a real conversation? Or are we just doing a perfunctory check-in around whatever, right? Because I think that we've gotten used to it. And maybe you could try it. The next time somebody asks you in this room, the next time somebody asks you how you're doing, or the next time you ask somebody how they're doing and they say fine, just say, oh, tell me about fine. What's fine? And just maybe watch their energy, they may be shocked. They may be like, what are you doing? You're messing up the flow of this conversation. Like, because oftentimes we're not used to people actually really asking us how we're doing. We use how you're doing as a greeting as opposed to an inquiry. And so I think in our work, we're trying to like change those norms that says, I say fine even when I'm not fine. And I listen, here's what I'm really saying about everybody. I'm not here to tell you should tell everybody your business. That's not what I'm here to say. And I'm not here to say that you shouldn't have masks. I got some good ones. The question is, do you have somebody in your life where you can go and take it off? Do you have somebody who you know when they ask you how you're doing, they don't just mean a perfunctory passing by, fine, hi, I'm good, as opposed to knowing that you're going to make time to listen to how they're doing. And that's what I'm trying to say. And I think, yeah, just in case anybody thought I was trying to say that you should tell everybody your business. That's not at all what I'm trying to say, but that's our work. Our work is helping young people reprogram when we ask them how they're doing. And they say, fine. And we say, okay, move to the next one. I even talk to parents who do the same. They love their kids. The kid says fine, they just move on because they got other things to think about. They got 3 other kids to ask how they're doing. They're doing the rhythm, and it's not to judge. It's to say, but make sure we know that when they're not doing fine, that they can tell you, right? And that they know that they can slow you down because they know you're like all that to say. Our work is about communication. If we're going to talk about emotions, we got to be able to communicate better. We got to have trust and safety to do that. And I think that's what's really important in our work.
You know, real quick, I love that. I'd like to tie this to one other thing that we see in the 40 developmental assets. It's probably one of the most significant 40 developmental assets, and that's a caring adult. Are you involved with a caring adult? And I think a caring adult is one who listens, one they can present the problem to, but it doesn't tell us you need to be a caring adult that can fix the problem. Right? You just need to be a caring adult that hears them, is compassionate, probably gives them some good advice or some leveling or some grounding or some advice. But that caring adult is the big thing. It's not the caring adult with the answers. And I think that's that developmental asset. And that speaks a lot to emotions, right? That they're looking for an anchor. They're looking for a buoy. They're looking for something to hold on to. I think that's really key.
Shanti, you said something that was like, you don't always have to, or we're not expecting you to always have your mask off, but to have someone that you can come to when you want to or when you need to. And I think that's super important. And Bill, like you said, and I hope folks understand that, like, you're not expected to always have the answers to absolutely every single problem. But, in our role, we are expected to hold a space for young people so that they can feel, comfortable enough to come to us, to communicate with us what's going on. And there's ways that we can support and equip ourselves to be able to hold safer spaces for young people. But to have every single answer, I don't think that's at all the expectation. And I wouldn't want anyone to feel like they need to hold themselves to that type of an expectation.
All right, thank you so much. We've got 3 minutes here. So what would be a cool way, round robin, 30-second closeout? How's about 3 things you want people to know about young people and emotion? 3. Three takeaways.
I think, yeah, I don't have 3. I have probably lots, but here's what I want people to take away. I mean, and I think about young people, and this is a young people who I met yesterday who was thinking about making their mask. Through 3 is they care, they're paying attention even when they don't act like it, and they're just as human as you are as an adult. They just only breathing less. So, and so I encourage people, the last thing else, yeah. So I'll stop there, but yeah.
Thank you.
3 things.
Bill, 3 things.
Oops, sorry. I probably have 300. I'm like Shanti, I could go on all day. I kind of feel like we just cracked open you know what I mean? We cracked open something much larger today, which is great. And I'm glad that we cracked that open. I just think there's so, I don't want to say this. There's so many fingers in this. There's so many things that run through everything we talk. We're humans. We're emotional. We're dealing with other humans. I guess the one thing I would say is we need to embrace. I think I embrace it. I think most of us here in this room embrace it. but the fact that we may not, even in our embracing of that, realize the scope and the size of what we're talking about and how it relates to everything we do, especially in the work we do, but in everything we do. So, I mean, like I said, as I started going through the stuff earlier, before the thing, I kept going, well, that's this, and that's this, and that's this, but I've never really put this, and this to that, right? So I think it's, for me, even personally, extremely eye-opening. It will help me with I'm a pretty intentional guy, most I do, but I'm gonna be more intentional because now I have more information to work with to have that intention. So just a fantastic 2 hours, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Bill. Amel, 3 things.
I don't know if I got 3 things. It's just gonna come out, you know me. I think I would just, want folks to, again, leave, remembering and, kind of really standing firm in that emotions are valuable information, and to recognize that there's, that our young people are very powerful and capable people, and our emotions are just a reflection of how powerful and capable young people are. And then I would encourage folks to continue to come to spaces like this, continue to have conversations like this. It's this building of, again, no one is expected to know absolutely everything, but it's this building of understanding and awareness and taking the time to challenge what we may have been brought up to think and understand as to what a positive learning space is, or positive youth behavior, or positive youth emotion is, and how that's exhibited, to challenge that. And it's in these spaces, in these conversations, that we're able to challenge that and build better spaces for our young people. So keep pulling up to things like this.
Thank you, Amel. All right, Natalie and Reed.
I'm still going back to the girls of color who are punished for expressing emotions, and it makes me think about how political emotions are, and the powerful people can express their emotions, less powerful people aren't allowed to. And on the other hand, I feel like we all, Brandon and others have said, you can't force them, you need to ask their permission. The last thing adults should do is try and tell kids what they feel or make them try and talk about it. We need to respect kids' own autonomy and their own boundaries. And then somehow it all comes back to the program as a whole, trying to cultivate those norms that Ashanti was talking about. Creating, really kind of cultivating wisdom of how you create a space that allows for kids from different cultural backgrounds and different emotional norms to feel at home, comfortable, and have chances to talk that move them ahead and into future jobs and the crazy world that they're going to have to navigate as they go on.
Thank you. Natalie.
I want to just underline, how some people, again, like you might not call it this, but ways in which, that you are, supporting young people, giving them spaces to both express and to motivate, to validate how they're feeling about things. And then that sometimes it's not talking, but it really is like creative expression is a way that some youth, that you ask them, I work on the Scratch programming language. You ask some kids, they don't say anything, but you see what they create, the ways that they express themselves. Like in math, they're creating a program, they're creating, theater, or they're presenting for other youth, and their voice comes out so loud and clear and in different ways. So different media for different youth too is like, and again, a lot of you are already doing that, having ways that they're communicating through events or through creative media are other ways to really express youth voice and emotion, and to change situations and voice what they're going through. So thank you. I mean, it's so great to hear people's experiences, and Amel, Ashanti, and Bill, it's so valuable to hear the examples that you're sharing, really inspired.
Thank you so much for all of your contributions and the work you're doing in the world. If I had one takeaway, I would say insight into teen emotion can be found by reflection on our own emotional experience, and we can get some insight that way. Thank you all out there in webinar land for coming on by today. You will be getting a link of these materials in an email from us in a little bit. We're having another webinar on the 27th. Yours is on the 24th. We have one on the 27th. It's going to be focusing on the worker shortage that we have in the after school world. It's everywhere. It's also in the after school world. So we hope you come by and join us for that. And we appreciate y'all. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Amel, nice to meet you. I want to, we should connect. I think